Hey guys, welcome to episode 25 of the series on Van Gogh's letters. Good to see you here, Sharon, Robbie, Tommy, Paddy, and for those of you who voted, the vote or the what's the word? The question in the poll is how and why were things finally resolved between Vincent and his family? Now, if you guys remember, he has just moved home, kind of reluctantly, kind of because he felt he didn't really have any other choice. Now that he's home, he's actually arguing with his family. They're arguing with him. They're really not getting along, and somehow things resolve themselves. And that is the thing we're going to deal with here. And I would say that I think he moves in with them early December. I would say by the end of January, things are resolved. And so one's kind of got to ask, how did that happen? And we're going to deal with the answer to that in this episode. We're also going to be coming into a new dimension to some extent of his art, which is going to be definitely quite interesting. Uh, okay, so I think just while we're waiting for a few more people to come in, I'm going to share with you guys a little story of something that happened to me today. It's a true story, but it just shows um, the level of application true crime, the techniques we learn in true crime, the psychology, all the tools we use in true crime, the application that has in many elements of everyday life. And I'm going to just share with you one of them from something that happened to me today. Not there yet. Good to see you, Susan, as well. So I went to a physio today, and what was really interesting was it was the first time I was there. I've obviously been to physios before, but this was someone new. And yeah, just to be a little bit indulgent, I've just been struggling with quite bad spasms and pain in my gluteus maximus. That's from a lot of cycling training I've been doing while the Tour de France is going on. And so it's basically the bum muscle that was tightening and so on. And so it was so bad that I couldn't sleep at night. Just if I stood up after sitting, it would go into a spasm so bad that I'd sort of cry out. I couldn't really help but like not scream, but just like kind of thing. And it's just really been really, really bad, like a constant aching pain. And as I say, after sitting and standing, it sort of is particularly painful. So I went to the physio, and what was really interesting was she spoke to me about the timeline. So we basically went through my backstory, and I had to give her my timeline of relevant things that had happened, and it made me think a lot about crime. Like she was trying to solve the case of what is going on with me, and one of the things with true crime that true crime teaches you is that everything is connected. And you will know if you someone who's a medical doctor or a physio that there's also connections in terms of the human body. One thing affects something else. And so it actually turned out that my broken rib has to some extent affected the broken rib on the back side of my body on the left has actually started affecting the muscles and the mechanisms on the right side of my body, right? Along with a few other things as well. And it's just really fascinating how that whole application of true crime even works in something like that. How things are connected. And I think we live in a very fragmented society. I think we live in a society where we suffer from amnesia, where things seem very disconnected. We seem very disconnected from nature, from our environment, from one another. But no matter how disconnected we are, there are nevertheless connections and dynamics that are taking place anyway. And in a weird way, we've got to play catch up to them. We've got to remember them. We've got to, what's the word, figure them out. They're already there. We just need to, it's almost like remember who you are, or remember. It's really a process of remembering that we come back to reality, I think. So I just want to share that with you guys. By the way, if you're hearing rumbling in the background, we've had quite a lot of rain and cold and storms, so that's really what you're hearing. Paddy says, do you have a treatment plan? I guess I do. I'm going back on Friday. So I think I'm in good hands. Yeah. So that's the first thing I want to share. The second thing is from this book. Can you see it? We just go back to StreamYard. And it's really dealing with this section here, the years in Noonan. The problem is with this technology, I can't do what I did on my cell phone because it does this. You can't really see it. But as we go through these pages, it sort of deals with some of the artworks that he did while he was in Noonan, some of the figures that he painted. I don't know if you can see that very clearly. Talk about reality. It's like you can't tell where reality starts and the pictures end. But this is really what I want you to see are the weavers. And then there's another one here at the bottom, right? And somewhere here, here's some more of the weavers. And then somewhere here, I think he painted birds' nests, which has got some application in what we're going to talk about today. I think it's just some more of the paintings that he did while he was in Noonan. It's weird, if I just lift it up, I disappear as well. Okay. So here's the potato eaters, and then on the very next page of that, maybe not the next page, the page after. Just trying to, somewhere he's painted bird's nest. Where is it? I think it's over there. You see the bird's nest at the bottom there? Okay, you can't, it's quite difficult to show it to you, but what I'm trying to sort of emphasize is that in this book dealing with his backstory, there's actually another drawing here as well, another painting of bird's nest there as well. So he's actually got two paintings of bird's nests, and it follows quite closely to the potato eaters. And what is also quite interesting is when he drew these thatched houses, he tended to think of these houses. That's frustrating how it won't show it. What's frustrating about these houses is how I think you can see that is how those houses resemble birds' nests in a way as well, isn't it? So I'm just going to read about a paragraph or two from the years in Noonan. It's from page 39 of this book on Van Gogh. And it's just to really get us up to date with where we are. And then we're going to go to the letters. Let's have a look at what you guys are saying. Okay. An artist pure and simple. Van Gogh stayed at the Noonan Vicarage longer than at any other single place in his entire life as an artist. That's something that actually came up previously. I think I put it up as a poll as well. And what that shows you is, although he started off moving back to Noonan, bickering with his parents not being very happy, they ended up resolving things quite well to the extent that he ended up living there and being settled there for longer than at any other place during his entire life as an artist. That says something, doesn't it? That's why I say it really set him up as an artist, this period. It goes on to say, quote, he was constantly at loggerheads with his father and even vented his unrelenting mockery of society on his long-suffering brother Theo. But Van Gogh could now devote himself entirely to painting. So he didn't have to worry about money as much, or meals, or whatever, accommodation. He was using oil on canvas, which he had previously been mostly unable to afford. So the oil on canvas aspect was a new dimension that was opened up to him now that he was staying in Newnan. That was the advantage to staying there. He tried to perfect his command of the three types of picture he had hitherto been concentrating on: still lifes, landscapes, and genre paintings. Working on various series at the same time, he used up all the suitable subjects he could find around the village where his parents were living. And that is as far as I'm going to take it. So in the midst of a kind of adversity, in the midst of going home and not being terribly happy, his art actually starts to blossom and to flower. And as an artist, certainly, he starts to really come into his own. And I think that is a great credit to his family. Yeah, Tommy, you're absolutely right. His paintings are still very dark during this time. So that is certainly true. That is certainly true. But we're going to be dealing with an aspect that touches on exactly what you're talking about: the darkness, the dreariness. Is something that starts, something knocks at the door of that. We're going to be dealing with that in this particular episode. Okay, so we're going to be starting our analysis with this letter from the 21st of December, 1883. And if you're interested in following it, I'll put a link to that so you guys can read if you're interested. Paddy says how fortuitous that he was finally able to do oil painting. Absolutely. Yvonne says, apologies for tardiness today, but I couldn't miss. Good to see you here, Yvonne. Okay, so this is the letter we're going to be looking at, and let's get started. Dear Theo, I received your letter today and also one from friend Rappard in the same mail. Let me begin by thanking you for the money. And let me add at once that I appreciate it that both you and Rappard approve of my coming here. So you remember in the poll, I asked you guys, did Rappard and Theo convince Vincent to go home? That is one of the answers. That is one of the answers. But the clue is that it's one of the answers. And we're going to be dealing with the other aspects in due course. So he says, so obviously the fact that Theo and Rappard are both giving him kind of the same advice, saying, dude, go home. It's going to be easier for you. It's going to be better for you. So he follows their advice. He says, I appreciate it. And he says, what you guys told me gave me courage at a moment when I myself was hopelessly discouraged about coming here. Think about those words. You gave me courage at a time that I was hopelessly discouraged, right? And bitterly regretted it, because on my part, I perceived deep in the background of all the discussions I had with father a je ne sais quoi of cold reticence over reconciliation, a cold evasiveness, which made me desperate because I saw that there would remain a cancerous root which would later make everything as impossible as in the past. Now, if you look at the letter and you look at what he's saying in this letter, it's quite hard to believe that he's going to end up here longer than any other place. And I think it's worth thinking about how our own words can condemn us, right? Vincent doesn't actually know it, but he's about to start an incredible journey as an artist and is going to get a really great push during this time right now, right? And yet he sees this as a horrible time, as the opposite of an opportunity. He's frustrated, right? And so all I'm trying to say is sometimes you're in a situation that you really don't want to be in, that seems, for all intents and purposes, to be going backwards, to be, the opposite direction that you want to be going. And it can actually be the best thing for you. And the person that's actually standing in your way is you. It's not money, it's not parents, it's not someone that you were in love with, it's not whatever. The person that could be standing in your way is you. This is certainly the situation here with Vincent. And I mean, look at how he describes it. A cancerous root, that is how he's seeing the situation that he's in. And instead, it's actually a root that is going to grow and blossom and is going to have this actually incredible experience in terms of as an artist. He's really going to grow as an artist. Then he says, but your letter and a very intelligent, very kind, very cordial letter from friend Rappard, and both your opinions that my journey hither might bring about some good, have induced me not to consider the case as lost yet, but to practice patience and wisdom. So one can also say that this did end up being very sort of wise, sage advice from his brother Anne Rappard, right? Now, the part that's going to be a little bit frustrating as we go through these letters is we know the outcome. We know that things are going to be resolved by the end of January. We're now almost at the end of December. But you're going to nevertheless find Vincent arguing and complaining repeatedly before we get to that point. And so I just want you guys to try and bear with that. It is something that goes on a little bit. And a lot of these letters are quite lengthy. So he says, as for me, and a lot of it's complaints about his father, he says, as for me, in many respects, I know father very intimately and thoroughly. And in the matter we are faced with, it is impossible for me to leave things as they are. Again, he's using very strong language. He's actually using words to condemn himself and I guess his father as well. And it's actually going to turn out to be not impossible. What he thinks is so unlikely and so difficult is actually going to be resolved in a very strange, almost accidental way. So he says, I had to get father's opinion about this and that in order to compare it with certain precedents. For instance, I directed the conversation to subjects that had nothing to do with the matter in question and then got enough troubles. Do you know your advice? Do not speak to them about certain things. Makes me think you refer to one particular thing of which you take a correct view. I'm not sure what that one particular thing is, but I would suspect it's talking about sin. I would suspect that one particular thing that he shouldn't talk to his father about is this lady that he has been in a relationship with, and he actually still feels a connection to. Then he says, but in reality, that question of long ago was of the utmost importance. At least to me personally, I mean, entering upon a new future with father is once again a highly important thing, which nobody can ask me to engage upon, leaving things as they are. At the moment, particularly after the receipt of your letter, father and I are on the best possible terms, and father is not even disinclined to make certain arrangements. Besides, I want you to know I quite agree with you that they mean well. I do not suspect them of consciously wishing any adversity to befall me, although at times they bring it on me, or of intentionally putting obstructions in my way, although occasionally I'm thwarted by them. But father's character is highly variable and at the same time highly obstinate. I know most people do not know this. Father's character is dark. Father has a very narrow-minded, or rather icy cold quality. And you can kind of think that a pastor can sometimes come across that way. If you, at cross purposes with a very moral person, can feel like you are very invalidated, right? Then he says, I cannot express this, I can only feel it. I've often thought this problem over. I've paid a great deal of attention to Father. I know Father from various angles. Very often I've tried to come to an agreement with Father, yet I do not think Father good. It's quite a um, quite a disturbing accusation that he thinks, I don't actually think my father's a good person, right? A good man, right? That's quite a indictment of his father to actually send to his brother. Then he says, I cannot declare that I think father straightforward or simple or clear-headed enough. And now there is, and there will remain, a je ne sais quoi that worries me. And at the back of it all, I'm aware of the same fatal atmosphere as in the past. I was struck by the fact, Theo, that friend Rappard now writes that he had perceived that during the summer of the year I stayed at Eton, that's when he was staying with his parents in Eton, I changed so much. It was then that I met her. I think this could be a reference to Kivos. It's either Kivos or Seen. But anyway, it's a woman. And he says, at the same time, he hints that he understands something happened then, though he does not know what. As I see it, father and mother and some others acted with very little delicacy at the time. One can also say that to some extent about him, that he seemed to be a little bit indelicate in terms of his feelings. He says, if you should be able to agree with me on that, Theo, I should like to say to you, they show the same lack of delicacy now, and you should know something of it. So essentially what Vincent's saying here is that I'm not very hopeful that things are going to work out. I'm very worried. I'm very depressed. Nothing has changed. He's almost saying, I hate my parents. He's almost saying, we don't get along. This is not going to work out. And the past is still very much something that is worrying him, right? Then he says, although you need not attach much importance to some conversations with father in the beginning, by which I only attempted to discover what father thought of things, although all this means nothing, and at the present moment some arrangement might be made, which in many respects would make my work easier for me and give me the inner quiet to work. Yet I see at the outset a je ne sais quoi, especially in father, which fills me with anxiety, a heavy still anxiety about the future. So in a sense, that is a really good thing that he's experiencing. In other words, he is grounded. He is not how can I put it? He's not floating in some kind of delirium. He's not daydreaming. He is in a place of gravity. He is thinking about his future. And it's at this point that his future actually begins to awaken. Does that make sense? So sometimes when you unhappy, that is the beginning of the seed that needs to grow. It doesn't grow in happiness. It actually grows in a place of care, concern, and thinking about your future, right? Then he says, keeping the peace with father is a hard job. Once again, I understand my own rebellious attitude in the previous period. I do not say it will lead to nothing, but I point out it will be difficult. So that's also another good sign. It's a good sign that he's actually been quite realistic about what lies ahead of him. So even though, this is quite important, even though he is aware of his parents' faults, he's also aware of his own faults. And that is the beginning of a kind of an inner reconciliation. Do you remember in the previous episode, we spoke about him acknowledging that he accepts that he's a sort of a dog, and that he accepts that they see him as a sort of a shaggy dog that whose bark is so loud, and so that is something that he's at least moved to that point, which is to some extent a progression from the last time they saw him. He's more realistic about who he is, and he's more realistic about who they are and how they see him. That's definitely a good place to start. Then he says, you will point out to me what I know full well myself, that in many respects I personally am very difficult to deal with. That is also a very good sign that he says, that he acknowledges, you know what, I am very difficult to deal with. How many of us can say the same thing? You know what, I am actually quite difficult to deal with. Well, as soon as you say that, you are softening your own rough edges. You have a bit of a sense of humor about yourself. You have a bit more, you're not taking yourself so seriously in a sense. Right. Then he says, yes, that is true, and I must take it into account too. There is an excuse for me, and that is the passion and the frequent absorption which everyone who paints, writes, or composes must needs have. I think this is quite a clever point he's making here. And he's basically saying, I'm allowed to be moody and difficult because I'm an artist, right? And to some extent, I think that's true. Artists should be given a bit of leeway to be strange, odd, rude, objectionable because of the way they engage with their subject matter and need to engage with it. Sky says, I'm not getting notifications anymore. I just don't think it's necessary to sort of say every single Wednesday and Sunday that there's a live, especially when they at the same time. I don't think it's necessary to do it every single time. If the time changes, then I will do that. I also think it alienates people who aren't interested at all. So you've got 400 patrons being told that there's a live and only maybe 10 or 20 actually care about it. The other 400 are sort of put off. It's like, oh, I didn't need to know this kind of thing. So that's really the reason. I do tend to put it on Twitter, and I also put it on YouTube for now. So anyway, he goes on to say, does the same apply to father? No, it is something else. If you should say, but father is also a thinker and a writer, then I answer, I wish he were this in another way. For now, I cannot call him happy. And I say this more sadly than you may think. What I say is serious. Is it impossible for you to enter into my feelings? I wrote you my last letter in a moment's desperation, of which the real purport was, I cannot do it after all. So he's referring to his previous letter where he was saying, I can't do this. So he's already made a bit of progress with that. And then he says, I thought a decisive separation from father irrevocable, the only thing I could do. If I do not do this, I should seem to be of one mind with a person whose principles I do not even respect. So again, he's talking a lot about how he disagrees with his father, and his father is actually going to die in about 2 years from now. So he's actually not going to spend a lot of time with his father still. And we spoke about, I think it's a bit of a crude example, but we spoke about Elvis's death and how the colonel behaved following Elvis's death. Well, when Vincent's father dies, Vincent actually paints a picture which shows to some extent, even in his father's death, there's still a sense of opprobrium. I think he's affected by his father's death, but there's nevertheless a sense of discord that remains, and that actually comes across in the painting that he paints at the time, but we'll get to that in due course. So what I'm trying to get at is there is a very real bumping of heads between himself and his father, and to their credit, they both sort of get around it. They make it that their relationship becomes a workable relationship. And you've got to think about it, for a pastor and a painter with a sort of, I don't want to say moral decrepitude, but a painter with the sort of attitude of Van Gogh to live together, you can almost see it as an impossible arrangement on both sides. And somehow there is this extended period, which is actually quite incredible. It just shows to some extent the depth of character and also the psychological resilience on both sides to deal with someone who's so completely different to you and so completely different in their beliefs, which are also evolving beliefs. Does that make sense? So anyway, it goes on to say, I am dead against him, absolutely in opposition to him. But now today I received your letter, and at the same time a letter from Rappard, written in a tone which I can understand and appreciate. And after another discussion with Father, we have arrived at a provisional arrangement and calmness. A calmness which perhaps is it, but which to a far greater extent is not it. I hereby declare that for myself, I agree with Rappard when he says, stay at home for a long time. He stresses this. So that is actually quite extraordinary, that he's kind of given an instruction. What you need to do now to be successful is you need to stay at home, not for a few days or weeks. You need to stay in one place for a while, get settled, get the momentum going, get back to what you need to be doing. And it is actually excellent advice. And he's heard it, he's repeating it, and he says that he stressed it. Look at the word long. He's stressed you need to be there for a long time. And ultimately he was. Then he says, there are a lot of reasons for this, Theo. Oh, if only you could see all that I see in it, how much security it might grant us for the future. I hope it will prove to be possible. It's quite interesting that he says grant us for the future. It seems like he's saying to Theo, if I stay at home for a long time, it's going to provide you and me security. Bear in mind, Vincent in a way sees himself as a partner to Theo in the sense of I'm going to send you my artworks and you're going to be able to sell them. And that's going to benefit me and that's going to benefit you, right? That's the idea anyway. Then he says, in Father's case, there's an eternal contrast between what he says and what he does. But it took me a long time to discover it and to understand that usually Father is not conscious of it, so that one is often unable to decide whether he really wanted to do what he actually did. I shall tell you frankly, brother, what I think of it. Father does not always know what he does, though he chooses his words awfully systematically. His actions are most haphazard. In short, it will be a very hard job to get good results from my stay here. So that is another really good statement from Van Gogh that shows how realistic he is. There's a book, I think it's by M. Scott Peck, and it starts off saying, life is difficult. Once you accept that, half the battle is really over, right? Once you realize that things aren't easy, well, that's half the battle won. And so he's already won half the battle. He knows it's going to be a hard job. It is going to be a hard job, but he's got the right attitude in a way. He's not quite there yet. It's not like his attitude is completely right, but he's on the way to getting the right attitude. Then he says, however, the circumstances are such as to make it urgently necessary that an arrangement is brought about that will really be carried through. So I think what he wants is, Dad, can you allow me to have a studio? And can I do this and can I do that? He wants arrangements made that are going to be long term. In other words, he's arrived back home and he wants a certain amount of control. He wants a certain amount of self-determination. And if you think about it, that is quite an important thing to do and to determine. So he's quite organized in that respect. So he says, I propose that the room that can most easily be spared shall be used to keep my things in, and if necessary as a studio, in case not only I, but you and I think it necessary and suitable that I work at home for a time, especially when there are financial reasons to force us to it. Business is business, and it is clear enough to you as well as to me that this is a good arrangement. I've been too long without this resting place, and I think that it must be settled in this way if we want to succeed in our enterprise. I believe it is possible, and I shall have the courage to start it when you and I agree that we must carry it through and settle that and settle that you will not be vexed with me. Vexed is sort of to be worried, I guess. To be I'm what's to be vexed, to be yeah, to be concerned, to be frustrated by something or someone. In case of some disagreement with father, I do not take it as seriously as I did 2 years ago. I will go on my own way quietly and follow your advice not to speak with father about several things, provided only that I find in you the person to whom I can speak about them and to whom I can say I should like to do this or that for this or that reason. Yeah, annoyed. Then I can leave father out of it and not discuss the problems with father. But it was necessary to break the ice. And I did this, and this I did by going to Noonan. And on that occasion, I had to have an explanation with father. However, I'm going to leave it at that. I must say, while I was reading that, I was just thinking, I have been to Noonan, and I should really share some of my photos of Noonan with you guys when I do the next live, probably episode 26. So try and remind me, or try and remind, or try and remember to do that. Okay, so then he goes on to say, it seems like he's trying to say to Theo, okay, I won't talk to Dad about my love life, but I hope I can talk to you about that and other sort of personal and sort of sensitive things. Then he says, I can tell you now that I've succeeded in getting father's permission to fix a room here. And I think the room that he eventually gets is the laundry room. He says, if you approve of it, this will become my regular storeroom and my studio in times when we have no money to be elsewhere. And about further arrangement and business, I will not speak first with father, but with you. And you and I together will get father so far that things will steadily improve in the long run too. So can you see how Vincent is sort of, although in reality he's really got very little leg to stand on, he's sort of making business relationships with both his brother and his father. He's sort of saying to his brother, you know, I'm in a sort of a business relationship with you. I'm going to be sending you art, and father is going to sort of help me in that endeavor, right? Then he says, I think you will approve of my having insisted on getting some fixed arrangement. I think it decidedly a good thing that I shall have a studio here, although I shall not always be in that studio. So let's stick to that and let this letter, not the last one, be our starting point. Well, brother, I'm only writing you on this. So I think that those are quite strong words in a sense. He in his own mind is thinking about what is happening right now as a starting point. And it's coming at the end of the year. It's just before Christmas. It's the 21st of December. And so in a very real sense, it is a starting point for Vincent van Gogh. Then he says, well, brother, I'm only writing you on this one subject, but your letting me know what you think of the Paris trade is very important to me. I shall let you do whatever you want to do, even in case you should turn to painting, for in the latter case, I'm convinced you would land on your feet. With a handshake, yours truly, or just yours, Vincent. It's quite interesting that he also, where he talks about starting point, he also mentions Paris trade. You know, I think if Vincent could wave a magic wand, he would have, instead of going home, gone to Paris. I think he was sort of wishing that his brother would extend an invitation. Anyway, then he has quite a long postscript. He says, I tell you, I do not choose to go through the same experiences as 2 years ago. I don't think I'm going to read this postscript. We know what it's about. It's still talking about things with his father, talking about it being icy cold. His father saying that in the past he acted according to his convictions and principles, and so on. And so it's really just the same thing. Look at that. He is a stupid one. So there's some negativity. You must know that if he's writing such long letters, he is sort of sitting alone for a lot of the time, even though he's at home. He's sitting at home trying to make this situation work, right? So now we go to the next letter from the 21st December to the 22nd. Now, as far as I know, I could be wrong, but as far as I know, there's not really much of Christmas mentioned here. But we'll see if it does come up. Not there yet says, don't look a gift horse in the mouth comes to mind in some way. I think it does, but I also think, bear in mind, Vincent probably doesn't want to go through what he's just gone through all over again. He's got to start setting everything up again, and he wants it done right. And the result is that things are done right. Things are organized in a way that they work for the long term. Anyway, he writes there to say that he succeeded in getting the laundry room set up as a studio. And he says he then went to The Hague to pack up and send off for his study sprint, etc. So you get the idea that he left The Hague, he sort of dropped everything, left The Hague and came home. And now he's got to go back to The Hague to collect the rest of his life. As poor as he is, he's got to go there and collect some of his belongings, which amounts to studies and prints and whatnot. So when he went to The Hague, he said, I spent the day with Rappard, who was very cordial and rather reassured me as to some scruples I had regarding the possible duration of the arrangement. I saw drawings and painted studies of his, which I thought very good, especially those of the workhouse at Terschelling. What a change you would find in his work. And then this, I've seen the woman again, a thing I've greatly longed for. So what you're getting out of that is a lingering threat to him staying with his father. Obviously, if he entertains Scene in a serious way, then that could be a threat to his current situation. And you're going to see over the next couple of letters that does become, it is repeated, and his feelings towards her are still quite strong, and him being so adamant about that present a very real threat to the everything being ruined, the whole setup at home being sort of thrown into disarray. He says, I feel that it would indeed be different or difficult to begin anew, but for all that, I do not want to act as if I'd forgotten her entirely. And I wish that father and mother would realize that pity is not limited in the way the world thinks. What do you think he means by that? That pity is not limited in the way the world thinks. I think it's like, you can maybe feel sorry for a dog that's out in the rain, or and you can feel sorry for a person who doesn't have any money or something like that. But sometimes pity can become love in a sense. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily good when that does happen, but I think that's what he's talking about. Then he says, you were the one to understand me in this matter. She has behaved bravely under the circumstances, a reason for me to forget the difficulties I had with her at times. So there is also quite an interesting acknowledgement that they obviously had some difficulties as well. Yvonne says, pity can also move a person to action. Then he says, and I mean, if you think about the Elvis and the Colonel, you sort of wonder, where was the Colonel's pity in terms of taking care of Elvis, kind of thing. Anyway, he goes on to say, I can hardly do anything for her now. I must at least try to encourage and fortify her. I see in her a woman, I see in her a mother, and I think every man who has the least manliness in him must protect such a one if there is an occasion for doing so. I have never been ashamed of it, nor ever shall be. While I'm writing in a hurry, a handshake, yours, Vincent, my dress, course taste number one, and I think I think he's writing this from The Hague. He's writing it from the perspective of he's gone there to collect his things, right? And then he signs it off saying, of course, I shall not stay here long. So he even writes a letter to his brother in the middle of moving, right? And it's not clear where he actually spends Christmas. Is he spending Christmas with Scene? Is he in The Hague, kind of busily moving his things around? Do they have a family Christmas in December 1883? Well, let's see what the next letter says. So this is late December 1883. Curiously, the first part of the letter is missing. Whether that's on purpose, we don't know. Why is the first part of this letter missing? Anyway, this is what he says in the part that isn't missing. He says, if you think it necessary for me to explain matters more clearly, well, yeah, you are. You say yourself that you wanted me to leave the woman. Yes, leave her completely. So it's possible that when Theo read this letter, the statements and sentiments expressed in the beginning angered him, that he tore the letter up or that he scrumpled it up. As we played, I don't know if you remember when we played snippets from the documentary, you see Theo being really disgruntled and angry, that he, to the extent that he crumples up a letter and tosses it onto his table. You can kind of imagine that was the precursor to this particular page. Sky says, I wonder how long the letters took to arrive. I don't think it was more than about a day. I mean, at that time, the post was very regular, and the distances between towns in the Netherlands are particularly small. So I don't think it would be more than a day. I think 2 days at the most. Bear in mind they've got trains and carts and whatnot, but trains in particular. Then he goes on to say, all right, but I can't and I won't. So Theo says, you want me to leave the woman, you want me to leave Scene. I can't and I won't. Do you understand, my friend? Such a thing would be treacherous. And so through a lot of this letter, he basically argues that I'm not going to leave her. There he says, and this I reject. Just basically saying I am not going to change there as well. And basically standing up for the fact that he's going to remain with this woman. No one's going to talk him out of it. And ultimately, obviously, he is convinced either way. He says, if the woman were not there, I should be prouder than ever. He says, and yet you will not be able to force me to renounce her, whatever your financial power. So you can see this is quite a hectic letter. And then he says, and seeing that I shall make no concessions in the matter of the woman, that's another big statement. I'm not going to make any concessions. I will do what I decide is right. I will clearly declare it loud enough for even ears that are most hard of hearing. I announce it in advance that I have resolved to share with her all that is my property, and I do not wish to accept any money from you, except what I may regard as my property. So pretty strident. He's pretty strident here, isn't he? Welcome to May, who's a new member. Thanks for joining us. And then that is the end of that letter. And then there's a postscript, quite long as well, where he talks about coercing. I'm not coercing her. I'm not trying to force her. And all of this is really about leaving her or not leaving her, right? He says, I tell you that you may reduce the money or stop sending it altogether, but she shall have her share of all that I have. And the sense that you get from him is that, or the sense that I get, and I may be wrong, is that he has been away from her for a couple of weeks, and now he sees her again, and probably, maybe, I don't know, probably he sleeps with her, and that kind of makes him feel like, I can't give this up, right? And if I do give her up, then when am I ever going to sleep with someone again when I'm living in Newnan, surrounded by clergymen, right? You kind of get a sense that it might be a kind of sexual desperation and maybe even a kind of a sexual blindness, if that makes sense. Don't know what you guys think of that. Corporal Deb, good to see you. I think Vincent may have had a tendency to be stubborn and protective of his personal life. That's a good point, but I also think that in a weird way, he'd been very self-effacing for a large part of his life. And a lot of the whole religious pursuit is, by definition, self-effacing. It's about being moral in the sense that you don't do this, you don't do that, you don't do that. And so I think, in a way, the pendulum is just swinging the other way. Okay, so then he goes on to say, I should be a coward, brother, if I were ambiguous about this. And if it should come about that I have nothing myself, all right, this would be the very worst that could happen. So again, he's making really big arguments that are going to be ultimately much ado about nothing. But anyway, he says, in short, rest assured that I believe I am entitled to do anything which does not hurt anyone else, and it is my duty to live up to the liberty which not only I myself, but every human being has an unlimited and natural right to. So he seems a little bit unhinged here. He seems a little like he's taking things a little bit too far. But as I say, the pendulum is going to be swinging back. He says, before I act, I most decidedly ask myself, shall I hurt anyone by doing this or that? But unless it is irrefutably proved to me that I shall hurt someone by doing a particular thing, I need not refrain from doing it. So absolutely no mention here of Christmas, but we don't know whether that was in the part that's missing. And it would be interesting to know, where did he spend Christmas? Did he spend it with his girlfriend and her family? What happened? So now we go from late December to still late December. Let's have a look at some of your comments. Tommy says, I think he's being selfish and adamant here. I see your point, Tommy, but okay, hi Lizelle, my girlfriend's watching me. I hope you have a good night's sleep with the storm in the background. So I think on the one hand he is being selfish, but on the other hand you've got to think about what's the alternative: going home to live with dad and mom, and sort of, he's 30 years old and now he must sort of be the shaggy dog. That's not terribly exciting either. So I think the fact that he's to some extent standing up for himself is a kind of healthy narcissism. But I think the other side is, he does need to, if he's going to be living at home, he does need to put aside some of his what's the word? He's got to put aside some of his sort of preferences in a way. He's got to put himself aside to some extent. He can't put himself first, right? Okay. Robbie Robbins says, hi, Lizelle. Okay. Right. So he says in this letter, it just seems like a follow on to the previous one. Dear Theo, mind you, I mean what I say about the woman. And that is really the theme for this entire letter. It's basically, I'm not going to give her up. Don't tell me what to do. And that's really the whole letter. So I don't know if you guys want me to go through it. Let's go through some of it. He says, mind you, all the disappointment that your visit of last summer caused me is something that does not count seriously with me. Then he says, cruel, I repeat the word, for what can be more cruel than depriving such an unfortunate and withered woman and her child of support? And so he goes on. He talks about good intentions. he says, truly, it is not a question of money alone, for the poor woman also misses myself too, the way I was to her and her children. That is to say, I had an affection for them, just as I now feel an equal and even greater affection for them. What you wrote in a certain letter about that I should render her and myself a disservice, kindly take it back, bearing in mind the service you rendered her last summer. Really, you cannot be too silent about it. So it's quite harsh language he's using to Theo. You don't often see him writing in this way, right? It's quite serious and sort of on the chin. Yari says, as regards the money, brother, you will understand that I no longer take any pleasure in it, won't you? You do understand this thoroughly, don't you? I took pleasure in it because it served to keep not only myself, but also these poor creatures safe. This is a sad letter at the end of the year. That's a good point. That just shows you that he can see what is going on in a sense. Sad for me to write, sad for you to receive, but it is worse for the poor woman. Goodbye, yours sincerely, Vincent. Then postscript. I've received more news from her, for I sent her to a doctor, and now I've heard particulars about it. Further, brother, my answer to your intimation that a calamity which threatened you had been averted. You know that my answer was cool. In this matter, I've no answer other than so much the worse for you, my friend. So it's hard to know what that calamity was. As for me, I'm chained to misfortune and failure. That's how he sees his circumstances. It is damned hard at times, but never mind. For all that I do, for all that I do not envy the so-called fortunates and the ever successful, as I can see through it too much. Then he goes on to say, I am far from confusing my own fate with the terribly aggravated misery of the prisoner, notwithstanding which, something of which I want to point out may be seen in our society. So I don't know if you remember in this book that I've got here, it describes Theo as the recipient of a lot of social criticism from Vincent, and he's described as Vincent's long-suffering brother, that his brother's got to endure all of this. I won't say nonsense, but there's a lot of, these are really, really long letters. And we skipping, to some extent, some of them. One wonders whether Theo did. But the fact is, Theo would always write back, and there would be a flow between them for many, many years. So he goes on, it is the principle of the Good Samaritan, Yvonne, well said. He says, as to me, I do not congratulate you on the fact that it may be expected that you will be able to keep the peace with certain authorities. It appeared to me that it was not superfluous to explain myself to you. You can interpret this precisely as you like. I've got to say, when you read Vincent's words, you kind of got to wonder, someone who uses words like that, superfluous and so on, how on earth does he speak to a prostitute off the street? You know, how do they have conversations? Anyway, thanks very much, Susan. Susan says, thanks for another intriguing live. Thanks a lot, Susan. I hope that's not a sign that you're leaving. There's still quite a lot to come. Corporal Deb says, wow, I think Vincent may have been pushed a bit into a corner by his brother and is angry with Theo for telling him things he doesn't want to hear. Being told no by Theo did not sit well with Vincent. That's a really good point. I think you can't easily say no to Vincent. You've got to, in a way, manipulate him or reason with him. You don't easily just say to him, Vincent, no. Then he really gets upset. Oh, I'm here. Good to hear that. May says Brian Laundrie only wished he could express himself like Van Gogh. Yeah, definitely. He goes on to say, and I mean, Van Gogh could spell, and Van Gogh was pretty well educated. Brian wasn't. Also, Van Gogh was educated to a great extent by other artists. I don't really think Brian was. Then he says, I do not forget either that at first you had compassion for the woman in question, but the very fact that I was and am far from blind to her faults, and notwithstanding this, tried and am trying to save her, ought to have induced you, I think, to respect my feelings. Then he says, now I caution you, perhaps, but because perhaps it is not too late yet. If things become worse, the time for cautioning will be past. Now, that is some of the harshest language you'll see between Vincent and Theo, and it's because of a woman, right? It's basically saying, I'm warning you, and consider this your last warning. And now we're still at the end of December. I think is there one letter left? This is the last letter. And the good news is once we get through this letter, we can start looking at Vincent's art once again. And I must say, speaking for my part, I'll be quite relieved that we can start doing that. It's like, Vincent, can you please get back to your art and stop all of this other stuff? Anyway, so he says, this is right at the end of the year. Dear Theo, last night I came back to Newnan, and I must tell you at once what I have on my mind. I packed my painting materials, studies, etc. at The Hague and sent them here, and father and mother have cleared the little room. I'm already settled in that new studio, where I hope I shall be able to make some progress. Then I must tell you that I've seen the woman, and that we have decided more definitely than ever to live apart, at least so that the world cannot justifiably find fault with it. So it seems between the two of them, and it's kind of quite ironic because it seems like in his previous letter, Vincent was saying almost saying to Theo, my way or the highway. And now in the very next letter, it's almost like his girlfriend has said to him, I think we should actually split up. All right. So anyway, that's the result. He says, once separated, we shall remain so, but we regret not having chosen a middle course after all. And even now, an attachment remains, which is too deeply rooted to pass away. So again, if we go back to the, what do you call it? If we go back to the poll, he did let scene go. So far what we've seen is Rappard and Theo convinced him to go home, and that caused things to be resolved. Also, he let scene go, and I think he realized that he needed Theo's help as well subsequent to this letter. But now, are things resolved? So far, all three of those things I've mentioned have seemingly come to pass. As we go through the first letters of January, ask yourself, have things been resolved? And you'll see the answer is no. So something else happens that actually solves everything. And it's actually quite interesting what that is. So he says here, do we want to go through this? Because a lot of this is about scene as well. Anyway, he says, I do not doubt your good intentions. He says, the decision lay with me, and if I did what I think was wrong, you are not the first I should reproach with it. Then he says, well, if what you said then were an isolated occurrence, I should not feel induced to refer to it, but it tallies too much with the opinions of others with whom I disagree for me to regard your opinions as wholly independent. So he's kind of saying that I think that Dad had something to do with what you were advising me to do. You pointed out a certain case to me in which it had worked, namely that a certain man had left a certain woman. This may be true in itself, very true even, but in this case it was not relevant. Look to her and me, that is another matter. And I have taken the liberty of thinking over whether it has worked. And my friend, this is exceedingly doubtful. I can tell you that the woman has behaved well, has worked as a washerwoman, to earn a living for herself and the children, so that she has done her duty, notwithstanding great physical weakness. You know that I took her into my house because at her confinement, things had happened which made the doctor at Leiden advise her to stay in some quiet place for her own sake and for that of the baby. So again, all of this is about seeing. He says there was anemia and perhaps the beginning of consumption. Well, as long as I was with her, she did not grow worse, but in many respects stronger, so that several ugly symptoms disappeared. But now everything has changed for the worse, and I fear for her life. And the poor little baby, too, whom I cared for as if he were my own, is no longer what he was. Brother, I found her in great misery, and I am in great sorrow over her. I know, of course, that it is more my own fault than anyone else's, but you too might have spoken differently. Now that it is too late, I understand better some fits of temper in her, and some things which I thought she did wrong on purpose, I now see as nervous symptoms, done almost unconsciously. Just as she told me on more than one occasion afterwards, sometimes I do not know what I do. So there is a very interesting quote from Scene that he provides verbatim, that she says, sometimes I do not know what I do. He goes on to say, for me as well as for you, there's an excuse in the fact that one does not know to what extent such a woman can be relied upon, and in the financial obstacles besides, but we should have chosen a middle course, and so on and so on. He says, well, our friendship, brother, has received a bad shock from this. And again, talking about financial difficulty, he says, I will end by saying, please think it over. But if your state of mind remains the same as last summer, after what I have said, I cannot feel the same respect for you as in the past. For the rest, so this came very, very close to the brothers, in a way, holding a grudge, or things breaking apart in terms of their relationship. It came quite close to that. So he goes on to say, for the rest, I've resolved never to speak another word with you about the possible change in your circumstances and your career, for it is as if I see two natures in you, struggling within your breast, a phenomenon I perceive in myself too. But it may be that some problems are solved because of my being 4 years older, problems which, in your case, are more or less in a state of ferment. Think over what I've said, that would be excellent, but you can also dismiss it from your mind. However, for my part, I wanted to speak frankly about it, and I cannot conceal my feelings from you. Now, again, I want to highlight this, that he says here, that he is a very expressive person. Do you guys agree with it? That he wears his heart on his sleeve, certainly in terms of Theo. That he says, I want to talk, and he talks exhaustively about Scene, and he talks exhaustively about his feelings towards his father, his feelings towards his brother, and so on. And he also says, I can't hide my feelings from you. And so if you jump forward to July 1890, well, why didn't he speak frankly about, I'm feeling depressed, I'm thinking of taking my life? Someone who was always sharing his feelings with his brother, why wouldn't he do it then, right? Then he says, as to my opinion, how far one may go in a case of helping a poor, forsaken, sick creature, I can only repeat what I told you already on a former occasion, infinitely. On the other hand, our cruelty can be infinite too. With a handshake, yours sincerely, Vincent. And then that is the end of December. And we now go to January. And this is where these Weaver pictures come out. And at last, he's drawing and painting again. There's a wood auction, which I don't think this is a terribly good picture. seems like he's lost his mojo a little bit in terms of his art. And then I think there are more pictures in the next letter. We'll get to those in a moment. Okay, so he writes, Dear Theo, I still have to thank you for your letter of January 1st and the enclosure. So I think the enclosure refers to money. With regard to being brotherly, it would appear to me that this is dependent on taking the same view of things or not, which I pointed out to you, seeing that it seemed to me that perhaps our opinions were going to deviate considerably, if they haven't already. If I observed a deviation already, not simply imagined it, I repeat, I mention it because with you, I do not want to pretend to be different from what I am. Quite a big statement. In other words, he's saying, with you, I want to be authentic, right? With you, I want to be authentic. And because of the very fact that I do not want to quarrel, in the long run, I should prefer to do without your support, however much your help means to me, to keep it on condition that I act contrary to what I think is right. The more so because in later years, if we live to see them, it is possible that you will not continue really believing in what you now suppose to be unshakable. But this is not the point under discussion. As to what you say about my perhaps being quite isolated, I do not say that this will not happen. I expect little less, and I shall be content if life remains possible and bearable for me. Now, that is a really good point, is that Theo is worried that now that he's no longer with Scene and that he's not really getting along with their father, he's worried that Vincent's fate is that he's going to be quite isolated, and that is that is true. That is definitely true. I think Brian Laundrie's concern, and for that matter also Gabby Petito, was that if things didn't work out between them, that they were going to be quite isolated. Bear in mind, Gabby had moved to Florida, where she's supposed to live now. Does she have a place to live? What's going to happen to Brian? So this feeling of being isolated when a particular relationship comes to an end is very real. He says, I do not say that this will not happen. I expect little less. In other words, I expect I will be quite isolated. I will be alone. But I shall be content if life remains possible and bearable for me. But I declare to you that I should not consider this a deserved fate, for I believe that after all I've never done and shall never do, anything to make me lose the right to feel one with my fellow creatures. Others would be greatly to blame for it too. Well, I try to look at myself as if I were somebody else. That is to say, objectively, so that I try to see my own shortcomings as well as perhaps their compensations. And I know several stories of men who had to live relatively very isolated lives just because neither of the two parties found them exactly as they wanted them to be. There are two kinds of fellows who stand between the parties. Firstly, those who have no personal character, but secondly, those who most decidedly have character, but as I said, who are not exactly what either one of the parties would have the say wants them to be. Which version of Van Gogh do you think he is? Do you think he's someone with no personal character or someone who most decidedly has character? Then he says, isolation is bad enough. It is a kind of prison. To what extent I shall become so I cannot be guessed now with any degree of certainty, nor do you say so, in fact. So this is actually a very important, with character. It's a very important topic because how Vincent can tolerate being lonely is going to play a role in, for example, did he cut off his ear? Did he commit suicide? In other words, if he's someone who can be alone, if he's someone who can be miserable, if he's someone who can be frustrated, if he is someone who can be in a kind of prison, and that's exactly what the asylum was, and he spent about a year at the asylum of Saint-Remy, if he's habituated to those circumstances, then why would he commit suicide when things were actually going relatively well? He kind of had friends, he had family around him, he was productive, right? Then he says, I, for my part, often prefer to be with people who do not even know the world, for instance, the peasants, the weavers, etc., rather than being with those of the more civilized world. It's lucky for me. So since I've been here, for instance, I've been absorbed in the weavers. So it's quite interesting that at the very beginning of 1884, January 1884, he really brings up the weavers. And I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about weavers in a totally different aspect. But let's first go through what he says here. He says, do you know many drawings of weavers? I know only a very few. I began by making 3 watercolors of them. Those people are very hard to draw because one cannot take enough distance in those small rooms to draw the loom. I think that is the reason why so many drawings turn out failures. But I found a room here where there are 2 looms and where it can be done. In Drenthe, Rapard painted a study of it, which I like very much. It is very gloomy. They are but poor creatures, those weavers. I've also made a drawing, just an impression, of a lumber auction. I wish you could understand that if at times I wish you had other thoughts about some questions than you have at present, I do so only because I believe you would profit by it, and not because I should want to make a proselyte, proselyte for my own opinions. I think that's a little bit like a disciple. It's not a very common word. It's probably a word that their father might use. It means a convert, a recruit, yeah, basically a like a disciple, a new believer, right? I do not believe my opinions to be better than those of other people, but more and more I begin to believe that there is something compared to which all opinions, mine included, become as nothing. Certain truths and facts which our opinions can change little or not at all, and which I hope not to mistake for my or other people's opinions, as this would be an error on my part. Opinions can as little change certain standard truths as weathercocks can change the direction of the wind. It's quite a poetic way of saying that, isn't it? Opinions can as little change certain standard truths as weathercocks can change the direction of the wind. I must say there are people out there. There are people in the news that remind me a lot of weathercocks. They seem to tell you what direction the wind's coming from, but it's actually not. The wind is coming from the direction it's coming from. The weathercocks do not make the wind east or north, nor can opinions make the truth true. What a great statement in the context of true crime. Do you guys agree? What a great statement in the context of true crime. And, you know, if Vincent van Gogh is anything, is a very authentic individual. He definitely sticks to his truth, come hell or high water. He says, I do not know whether you will understand me, but I wanted to make clear to you that I, thinking as I do, could hardly get cross with anyone merely on account of an opinion, not counting my own opinions for much, but my not being able to resign myself to the fact that I see many persons lead a life rather harshly, I think, too far removed from what is true life for all, is quite another thing. So if I get cross, it might be because of something that has nothing whatever to do with my having a high opinion of myself. There are things as old as humanity itself and which will not disappear in a hurry. I know of an old legend, I don't know of what people, which I love. Of course, it did not happen literally, but it is a symbol of many things. In that story, it is said that the human race descends from 2 brothers. These 2 were allowed to choose what they wanted above all things. The one chose gold, the other chose the book. The first who had chosen gold became prosperous, but the second one fared poorly. The legend, without explaining exactly why, tells how the man with the book got banished to a cold and miserable country and got isolated. But in his misery, he started reading that book and he learned things from it. So he managed to make his life more bearable and invented several things to get out of his difficulties, so that at last he acquired a certain power, but always by working and struggling. So what he's talking about here is someone acquiring knowledge, and with that knowledge they acquire power, and someone else acquiring power via wealth. What's the difference? Then he says, then afterward, just when he had become stronger with the book's help, the first one grew weaker, and so he lived long enough to learn that gold is not the axis around which everything turns. So that is also quite a profound statement from Van Gogh. He's saying money isn't everything. Knowledge matters, money isn't everything. It is only a legend, but for me there's depth in it, which I find true. The book does not mean all books or literature. It is at the same time conscience, reason, and it is art. That is such a wonderful and profound statement, isn't it? You know, Van Gogh definitely isn't a simpleton. Yvonne says truth trumps everything else. Then he says gold does not stand for money alone, but it is at the same time a symbol of several other things. But do not suppose that I want to force anything in this respect. These things must establish themselves. But saying a few words about things is different from forcing them. At certain moments, keeping silent about something is nearly identical with dissimulation, another pretty big word for a simple artist. I just did not want to do that. As for the rest, whether isolated or not, I will try to manage so that I can work on. And as to my opinions, I sometimes think of what Taine says. And the translation to that is, it seems to me that as far as the worker is personally concerned, he can keep that to himself. So it was probably a mistake on my part not to keep things strictly to myself. And bear in mind that I do not want you to consider the help you give me as a thing you are obliged to do. For you were not obliged to do it in the past, nor are you now. It has been a voluntary thing on your part, for which I, for my part, feel, and I repeat, shall certainly always feel a real obligation to you. Wishing you success in your business, yours sincerely, Vincent. And then he adds the following. Quite a deep letter, this, and I must say one of the best letters I think he's written. Once I read a remarkable saying somewhere about the possibility of becoming decidedly different in later life. In a biography of Corot, I found the following observation on the influence he had on Francais. I'm not sure if that means on the French. Anyway, he says that translates to, at 30, Francaise did not know what a neutral tone was. I only want to say that until late in life, one may have, surely as an artist, no less than as a human being, until late in life, one may have a certain stiff, rigid, let's say iron-like way of doing things, and of looking at things, and of working too. But for all that, one may gain later on in life gentler, more intelligent, more reasonable, more humane views. Now, again, this is really good news that this is his psychology, that he's saying, you know, maybe it is more mature to be gentler in your views, reasonable in your views, intelligent in your views, humane in your views. He says, I only want to point out that it is quite possible that as a human being and as a workman, you will acquire more of a nature, more tranquility, that you will get to be more your own self. I want to point out that now and then I do think you are natural, for instance, in other words, inauthentic. For instance, last summer in The Hague, at present this means nothing, and I don't in any way look upon this as your fixed and unchangeable character or state of mind, but as a curious phenomenon which I observe with interest and attention for the very reason that I myself have known moments of this state of mind, just at a time when I was on the brink of a mental revolution. Ah, well, wow, what a time for my voice to do that. Anyway, I would be quite curious to know what he means exactly by being on the brink of a mental revolution. I'd definitely be quite interested to know what exactly he means by that. I think I will try and look into that a little bit. Anyway, he says, there's something else that I want to tell you about my talk with Father. I pointed out to Father that in my present condition and state of mind, I sometimes think of going back to the woman I lived with. So actually says this to his father. He says, he's sitting at home and he says, Dad, you know what, I actually think maybe, sometimes I think I want to go back to that prostitute. And he says, yes, that I might even decide to marry her. You should know, however, but Father need not know this, that up to the present I've not changed my mind about the decision that it would be impossible and that living together again is out of the question. Just kind of saying, you know what, Theo, I've actually realized that it's really not going to work out, but I nevertheless have this feeling that I wish it did. He says, I mentioned it to Father in order to bring up again the question of the paternal right. So, in a way, you get the sense that he's testing his father. He's saying it to his father to see how he's going to react. And then he says, a question put forward by Father himself. On this subject, I said that Father's becoming my opponent in legal proceedings would, in my opinion, be anything but sensible. So, once again, you say, has Van Gogh got anything to do with true crime or the law? Well, he keeps bringing it up, doesn't he? It's to do with the law, morals, identity, authenticity, um, and getting to know the dynamics of a person in a very, very deep way. And that's something that's missing in true crime. We get a superficial view, often via social media, of someone, and we think that's sufficient. Anyway, he goes on to say, moreover, in such a lawsuit, it would be necessary to use trickery and false witnesses in order to give a semblance of justice to the obstruction of my intended marriage. That for my part, if people should try to put obstacles in my way under such circumstances, should defend myself quite calmly and collectedly, insisting on my rights and that I should never give in. Because I am convinced that it would be the kind of case in which the judge himself would urgently recommend an amicable settlement. Thus, I spoke to Father about the matter of marrying, taking the woman with whom I lived as an example of what might happen. But mind you, in this matter, I see no reason to go back on my resolution not to go and live with her again, the resolution that is known to her too. So it almost seems like he's wishy-washy, flip-flopping. Then he says, before I could change my mind with regard to this matter, a great many things would have to happen, things that are quite out of the question at present. So now you know what I want you to know, but I have discussed the matter with Father with the object of making it clear that if I should want to, Father would never be able to prevent it, that whatever may be said about a paternal right, I cannot find anything within the meaning of the law that would apply to me and would be used as an obstruction to me. So in a way, Vincent is asserting his power, in this sense, his legal power, quite rightly, but in another way, in a quite a misguided sense. But he's nevertheless saying, Dad, if I decide to leave here and I go to that woman, there's nothing you can do about it, right? And of course, that's never going to happen. He's not going to leave home. He's going to spend the longest time ever staying at home. But he's nevertheless, in a way, asserting a kind of theoretical power. He's saying, Dad, if I make up my mind to leave and I go back to that woman, you can't do anything. And his father's kind of got to acknowledge that point, which in a way gives Vincent a little bit of authority in his own right. Does that make sense? And then he goes on to say, Father has hinted at it so often, very vaguely but very palpably for all that, that I on my part decided to tell him flatly how absurd and coarse I should consider such a proceeding. It is a fact that now and then I think marriage would be a highly desirable thing for me. But as to this, I nevertheless have no definite plans, certainly not as regards the woman I lived with. So there's something quite sad about that. And I think, in a way, it's quite true. I think Vincent van Gogh is feeling quite like he needs to be with someone who loves him. He wants to be part of a family, but not necessarily his mom and dad. He wants to be sort of married and settled in that sense. He says, I know that that will be highly desirable for me, but at the same time, he realizes I'm not going to have that. That thing that I really need is beyond me. It's beyond my power. It's beyond the circumstances I'm in are preventing that. And there's something very sad and also wise about that, where the thing that he so dearly and desperately wants, and I do think that it would have been good for him, not necessarily with this particular woman, but you know, to be in a situation where things were quite settled, um, and then to go without that. I've got to say, thinking about it a bit more, I don't know whether if he had married, it would have worked. I think it would have been good for him to be in a good marriage, but I don't know how he would have found his way to a good marriage, put it that way. Theo did, but then Core didn't. His other brother didn't. His other brother got divorced. Yeah, I think, yeah, May says feels good to not be controlled. That's really what he wants. To say, Dad, you can't control everything. You can't control the inner part of me. Yvonne says, Vincent wants to hear his father just say, for once, you are right, Vincent. I think that's true. I think that is what he wants to hear. Okay, so now we go from the 2nd to the middle of January. I just want to see how many letters are left in January. 17, 18, 19, quite a few. I really want to get to the end of January, but it's kind of going to take a while. I may need to skip parts. See, we're already at an hour and a half, not really that far. Okay. So this is actually a letter to somebody else, a guy called Fernay, a land surveyor, and this guy went off to the East Indies, and he basically just talks about the paintings, the grey gloom of this country, and he talks really about other countries. Many French painters and others have felt the advantage of going to Algeria or Egypt, and I have the impression that the Indies will present similar effects to a certain extent. Some painters went to China and Japan and have seen excellent things from these countries. This is a little bit of a glimpse of his infatuation with Gogh, because Gogh was also quite well traveled, and there was this possibility that him and Paul Gogh were going to travel, I think, together to Madagascar to form a painters' colony. So this is an early escapism from Vincent van Gogh, thinking of traveling far away from his present circumstances. Yvonne says, I have to go at 4, unhappy face. He says, it pleases me very much that you go on being warmly attached to painting, and I believe that provided you persevere, you will go a long way, especially as you will have to be outdoors a good deal professionally. And then he sketches gardener with a wheelbarrow over here. He also talks about the weavers again. Then he says, enclosed another order for your father. I hope you'll be kind enough to select the watercolor brushes yourself. Not too thin and not too thick, the same as are generally used. Something like this. I will always remember with great pleasure many a walk we took together last summer, and be assured I shall never forget you, and you will greatly oblige me by letting me hear something from you as soon as you are over there. On my part, I'm going to send you a few sketches of things I'm working on. And now I wish you a pleasant voyage and prosperity in your enterprises, and particularly prosperity in your painting too. And then he provides this sketch, well, these sketches of weavers. And so with that in mind, I want to share something with you that you might find quite silly. I mentioned weavers to you guys in the previous episode. I don't know if you remember. I mentioned that we were getting to the weavers part of Van Gogh's story. And the crazy thing is the very next day, so I think Monday, so I mentioned the weavers, and the very next day, a weaver started building a nest in my garden. And I've lived where I currently live for years, for quite a few years. And um, there have been no weavers in my garden building nests. And it was just so strange that um, the day after mentioning weavers on YouTube, a weaver starts building a nest. And so I actually took some photos of the weaver, and I'm not going crazy. I realize a weaver of material is totally different from a bird weaving a nest. But I nevertheless found it quite interesting. Bear in mind that Van Gogh also painted nests. And so, anyway, I thought I would just share this with you guys. Some of the photos I took of this bird's nest, right? So that was right in the beginning where I noticed that really above my front door, just noticed this sort of circle of woven strands, right? And so I took a series of photos that I thought I would share with you. That's the bird that takes that makes the nest. It's the Afrikaans is a geelvink, which means yellow finch, but it's yeah, as you can see, it's a bright yellow bird. It's got quite a red eye. Its pupil will sort of expand and so on. It's a very noisy, cheeky, busy little bird, and in probably 3 or 4 days, it's managed to make a nest. So there's the nest again from a slightly different angle. There you have the bird inside the nest, or the beginnings of the nest. And I must say, after about a day, so the second day after it created this circle, I looked outside my window, and it was very cold overnight, and the this sort of arrangement was very bedraggled, and I thought, okay, that's it. He's going to abandon the nest, and that is it. And he then came back and he fixed it. There was frost, and there's also been rain, and this guy's been very enterprising and making sure that what he starts, he finishes. And so you can see how he's getting it going. The other thing that's quite interesting is the tree that this is constructed on is actually snipped off branches all around this particular branch, and he's done that so that for I think two reasons. The one reason is so that things like snakes and mice and cats can't sort of climb along the branch to the nest. That's one reason. The other reason is this bird will do a display. So once the nest is finished, the bird will sing and it'll puff itself up. And so he wants a clear sort of screen. So he doesn't want it to be in a situation where the female can't see what he's doing. So he's found a really nice branch where there's nothing behind him or nothing around him, nothing obscuring his view or her view, where he can kind of do his thing and be seen very, very clearly. So there's just another picture of him doing his thing. Now you must bear in mind he's got to be able to sit on this thing while he's actually building it, and quite incredible that he's like it's right in front of him and he's actually able to do it. This is the nest from another angle, so you can see there's that sort of round structure. Now he's already building the walls that are coming around like that, right? So from this angle, you can't really see how um, separated this branch is from the rest of the tree, but it is. So there he is singing. He's got quite a raucous little song. When he sings, his eye will sort of, he seems to get very excited. I don't know whether he's angry or what's going on, but his pupil will sort of dilate. You sometimes see that with birds. So here's quite a good shot where you can see the color of his eye. It's quite a reddish orange color. He's got quite a bright yellow feathers, and I think it's only appropriate that a bright yellow bird makes me think of something related to the Van Gogh story. So here is a picture of the bird kind of puffing itself up, and in the middle of a sort of a raucous song. There you can see its pupil is pretty small. And the female is very drab. She's sort of a dirty green color. And he's very bright and loud and, trying to get attention. And there's another picture. Or was that the same one? So there's another picture of it. You can see he's puffed up like a pom-pom. Also in winter, the male also looks quite drab. It seems to come out with very bright plumage in the summer. And so this is what the nest looks like right now. He's really done a very quick job at making this kind of work of art, right? And there's his tail. He's actually inside the nest at the moment. Although it's the middle of winter, this tree is actually getting ready to bud. So I hope he's gotten rid of some of these buds, because they can actually turn into branches, but no doubt he'll sort that out. So there he is, having done quite a lot of work over the past couple of days. He's now created a complete ball, in terms of his weaving story. There's just another view of him. You can see it's actually quite a attractive bird. Looks a little bit like a canary. There you can see just how bright the colors are again, and that eye. And that's it. I thought I would just share that with you guys. I hope you found that interesting. Now, the other thing I want to share with you guys is, and don't laugh, is this. Can you guys see what this is? This is a tartan pillow cover or cushion cover, right? And I've got tartan all over my home. My curtains are tartan, my couch is tartan. Here's another pillow, right? And the reason I'm mentioning this is because Vincent was sort of quite fascinated with the weavers, not the birds, but the actual weavers. And so he would see patterns like this, right? And what that is, you might say, well, that is a pattern of yellow, or how can I put it, lines across lines. But it's also juxtaposing certain colors, and in this case, blue and yellow, right? And that is something that Vincent noticed for the first time in his life. He started painting these weavers, and he started noticing the actual looms and noticing that so as he got to know these weavers better, they would say to him, and he would become aware that there were certain looms that were very vivid. And when you contrasted one loom with another, it could create an incredible texture. And obviously there were some textures and fabrics that were more popular than others. And one wonders where he got to see, for example, blue and yellow and red and green, right? Wasn't it with the weavers? So here's just another fabric, yellow and blue, but notice how it contrasts. And this is just from Etsy. And we know how he used yellow and blue in his Starry Night, right? Or just Starry Night. But there's something of the tapestry of the weaver, I think, in that. It's a tapestry of the heavens, right? So another example, so I've shown you yellow and blue. Well, here is red, right? This is just from Tartans of Scotland, and this is just green and red, right? And do you remember green and red in the Night Cafe? Green and red. And so I just wonder whether he first saw these patterns of color with these weavers, and although he saw it, he only applied it many years later. I just find that quite incredible. So the seed was sown in these dreary circumstances for something that would be ultimately quite amazing and quite magical. Corporal Deb says, nature never ceases to amaze me. Thanks a lot, Paddy. Paddy says your photography skills are top notch. I hope so. I used to be a professional photographer, so yeah. Yvonne says, wow, good insight on the weaving and color patterns. Thanks for that. Okay, so let's continue. I'm just not sure where we were. Oh, it's over here. Okay. So I'm going to try and get to the end of January, but we've got a little ways to go yet. Fortunately, not all of these are long letters. Okay, let's deal with that one. You still are in our book. Thanks a lot. Okay, Robbie says, sorry, I had to nip out. I'm dog sitting and the dog was restless. Okay, well, welcome back. Okay, so now we're at 17th of January, 1884. Dear brother, right? Now, before we deal with that, remember the poll. How were things finally resolved between Vincent and his family? Well, he let Scene go. 9% of you say that's the reason. He realized he needed Theo's help. 6% say that. And I think that's sort of true, that he wasn't like completely feeling like I totally am relying on Theo. He felt really obligated to Theo, but it wasn't like that was just kind of a small part of it. Rappard and Theo convinced him. Most of you, or a lot of you who didn't say the last one, said that. And then 67%, almost 70% of you say all of the above and something else. What do you think the something else is? So Yvonne, this is where we let you go. Unfortunately, you're going to miss this part, but I hope you come and check it out on the replay. So go well, whatever you're doing. So this is where we now deal with the something else. Okay. Dear brother, I just have to tell you something that has happened. Something has happened to mother. That's the title of this video. On getting off the train at Helmond, mother hurt her leg. Father says the doctor told him it was undoubtedly a fracture of the thigh bone near the pelvis and the hip joint. I was present at the setting, which came off comparatively well, so that I'm almost inclined to think it more a dislocation. The doctor assures us there's no real danger, but considering mother's age, it will take a long time. It's quite weird for me to read that because I went to the doctor myself today, not the doctor physio, and I also hurt myself in a similar place, sort of the hip area. Anyway, obviously not quite as serious. His mother fractured her leg or hip or something like that. He says, I wanted to tell you the exact truth, supposing that you would prefer that, but I give you my word of honor that it is not worse than I tell you. For the present, I will let you hear every day. By the same mail, I'm writing to your address, Rue de Laval, so that you may hear it as soon as possible, either at home or at your office. Tomorrow I shall write again as soon as the doctor has been here. It is a great misfortune indeed. I was painting at the farm when they sent for me. Mother is resting quietly now. Goodbye, boy, with a handshake. Yours sincerely, Vincent. Now, the next letter is quite amazing. If I remember correctly. So this is written 18 and 19 January. My birthday is actually 19th of January, 1884. Dear Theo, according to my promise, I'm writing you again now that the doctor's been here again. The first night has been very quiet, and seeing that much depends on quiet. The doctor is very satisfied. We asked him again to tell us plainly what it was, and it is a fact that the thigh bone is broken right beneath the joint. So you can see it's a really serious fall. And one wonders, did it happen on snow? Was there snow that she stepped on? Um, he says, you know that I was just going to pay off some debts with the money you sent, but as there will be many extra expenses, of course I told father he was welcome to use it. The other things can wait, and it was only by chance that I had not yet sent it off. I'm afraid it will be a long time before mother recovers. Now you can imagine Vincent giving his father his money, which is, I guess, Theo's money, but it's nevertheless him giving his father something to help his mother, but also his father's wife. You can see how this could be seen by his father's incredible gesture, where Vincent has seemed so selfish, so obstinate, so stubborn. In his father's eyes, perhaps so unchristian. Suddenly, his father sees him in a totally different way. He sees him as a human being. He sees him as a beloved son, right? He says, he writes the next morning, Saturday morning, I can tell you that this night has also passed quietly and mother has slept pretty well. She sends you her love. But it will last some time, brother, before everything is all right again. Theo, think it over well. If you cannot find some other way for me to earn something, money will be needed, and we must also consider once more the chances of selling my work. If it were only possible for me to pay my working expenses myself, so that you could give mother what you would otherwise give me. I told you already that I'm doing watercolors of the weavers here. I shall try to finish some, but I cannot give all my time to them, and I must be at home as much as possible, at least these first days. Well, as soon as the doctor has come again today, I shall send you a postcard. Goodbye. Now we go to the next letter. This is moving quite quickly. Amis Rapard, I want to tell you in a few words something which our minds are full of these days. My mother had a pretty serious accident getting off the train. She broke her right thigh bone. By the way, my not to be too getting too over the top on this, but it's my right thigh that is also a little. I'm experiencing a little discomfort. Am I channeling Van Gogh? Is that little bird in my garden the spirit of Van Gogh? I'm not really saying that. I'm just saying it's interesting. Anyway, it goes on to say the setting of the fracture went off rather smoothly. She's quiet and does not suffer much pain. But I need not tell you that we are all greatly worried about it. Now I'm glad I'm here, as my sisters are physically weak too, and I can easily find something useful to do. That's quite interesting. That's the first time he's actually mentioned his sisters. He talks about his father constantly, his mother almost never, and his girlfriend quite a lot of the time. You never hear at all really from his sisters. You certainly haven't heard of them for the last months, right? Um, and you kind of get the idea that they've been there all this time. What do they think of him? What do they think of him in terms of what he's been doing and so on? Then he says, my sisters are well enough otherwise. The one who is usually at Susterberg is the weaker of the two. I can hardly find words to describe how bravely the sister who was at home when you were staying with us is bearing up these days. My mother will require a lot of nursing. The doctor assures us that she can recover completely, but under the most favorable circumstances, it will take at least half a year, right, before she can walk again. And even then, that leg will be shorter than the other one. So this is the something that changed and made the whole family actually a lot more dependent on Vincent. The fact that the eldest son is at home when this disaster happens to their mother means that he can now actually help out around the house. And you can actually imagine that if he was living somewhere else, that he may have been recalled. They may have said, "We need you at home to come and help out," right? And so this guy who's felt like a nuisance and who's felt like a shaggy dog is now going to be quite useful and necessary, in fact. He says, "Just imagine that at present there's no doctor here in the village. At least my father will have nothing to do with the one there is. And so a doctor from Eindhoven must come in a cab every now and then." This also gives you an idea of just how weird, in a way, the Van Gogh family are. That there's a doctor in the village, but they for some reason, they don't think he's good enough. You kind of get a bit of a snobby vibe from them. Robbie Robin says, "Is Vincent allowed back in the house?" Well, no doubt. He's at his mother's bedside. Then he says, "It is certainly a calamity, the consequences of which I think are hard to foresee. Well, of course, we must live from day to day. As sufficient to the day is the evil thereof. Fortunately, she's quiet and clear-headed about it, so that she's cooperating to preserve the necessary calm. Please write me soon. Have you started something since I saw you? Something new? I'm still working on the weavers, but I'm afraid I'll be able to work only half time for a while on account of the unfortunate event, which has resulted in a lot of other things to do. As I wrote you, I've done several watercolor studies direct from nature. I'm going to start more elaborate watercolors after them, for I have to stay at home most of the time these days." I think that answers your question, Robbie Robin. "My mother and father join me in sending you kind regards. My mother had taken the train from Newnan to Helmond in the morning just to do some shopping. As she was getting off the train in the station at Helmond, she seems to have missed her footing. They had to take her home by carriage. It is indeed fortunate that, considering this transportation, things haven't turned out much worse, and that the setting of the fracture went off so well, though it was bad enough considered by itself. But all the same, a lot remains to be done. Write, if you can, with a handshake in thought. Ever yours, Vincent." And now we go to 20 to 24th January to Theo. "Dear Theo, up to now, mother's been pretty well, insofar as the leg remains in its bandage as it was set. But for all that, the days are rather gloomy." You can kind of imagine this big event taking place that sort of upsets the whole family dynamic. All the routines are totally different. Everyone is worried about Mrs. Van Gogh, and it's a very serious thing that has happened to her, but it also means things like she can't cook, she can't sew, she can't do whatever needs to be done in terms of the household. And so somebody else has got to do that. Then he says, "We have been talking over your letter in which you write you intend to come. Of course, it would be a great joy for mother to see you, but on the other hand, there's something which calls for caution, and that is the parting, when you would have to go back. And then it might be that mother might take your coming as a sign that she's in a very bad way." Quite a lot of, to me, overthinking going on here. It's like, I don't think you should come and visit because you're going to have to leave as well. Also, if you come and visit, you're probably going to worry mom that things are a lot worse than that they really are. Seems a bit over the top. Then he says, "But it is a fact that mother would be very glad if you came. I write about that coming because in case you do so, I should think it better not to surprise her, but to write about it to mother first. If there should unfortunately be a change for the worse, we should wire you at once, and you may always depend on it. Of course, your coming or not is a question which can only be decided by yourself. there's no definite immediate danger. And that's actually a reference to, could she die? Could she die from this? Is it life-threatening? And you might read this and think that's absurd. But bear in mind, this was 1883, and there were often complications and people died for far less, right? So he goes on to say, it is impossible to know how things will continue. I suppose Father has written you all the details, and he will write you again one of these days. I've no head for writing now, and I have little time for it, for when I am not with Mother, I am nearby at the Weavers, where I'm working on 2 painted studies. So there's a little bit of a glimpse into the everyday reality of Van Gogh right now. Is when he's not at his mother's bedside, he goes off to the Weavers and he's busy drawing, working on that. And that's that letter. And then I think there's one left, or is it two? One. This is the last letter in January. And I'm not going to take it further than this for this episode. I actually thought we were going to go, it was going to be close to 3 hours to get to the end of January, but I was surprised that these letters are so short. But so this is a letter from the 24th of January, and he's painted or he's sketched church in Newnan. That's this one. Let's take me away and let's have a look. Again, not terribly well executed. This actually looks almost like a witch. Not a terribly well executed sketch, is it? And then let's have a look at this one. Weaver facing right. I must say, he does a better job here, as far as I'm concerned, than he does with the portrait of Dr. Gachet. I mean, he captures the features here pretty well, whereas Dr. Gachet not terribly so. And then Weaver facing right, one window. Looks like he has a little child in a cot as well. So these are the people that are essentially neighbors, and that is what he's sort of doing. I don't think that's a particularly well executed sketch, but it's not bad. It's not terrible. And then there's this one. Are there any more? Then there's this one, Weaver with baby in chair. So this is, I guess, the sketch. This is the actual painting. And that's actually quite good. Or is that a painting, or is that a etching? I don't think it's an etching. Maybe it's also a sketch, but it's done quite well. You can think how the baby just sits there and does nothing, and it's just, doing this. And these are apparently quite poor people. They just weave blankets, I guess, all day. Okay, so let's go through this last letter of January. Dear Theo, I was glad to get your letter of today and the enclosure, and thank you very much for both. It seems to me that up to now, Mother's recovery is very satisfactory in general, and that there is less and less immediate danger, and that it is more and more reduced to a question of time. So there was definitely a concern that she could die. And like I've said earlier, Vincent's father will die in about 2 years from now, less than 2 years from now. He goes on to say, nevertheless, Mother will certainly not be quite the same after the fracture is healed. I believe that the effect on her and the unavoidable counter effect on Father will be that it will prove to have pushed them a long way into old age. So suddenly, Vincent van Gogh's mother falls, and suddenly their weakness and vulnerability is exposed to all, to them, to him, and it's now quite clear that they are in a little bit of a state of distress and that they need one another. He says, under the circumstances, I was glad to be at home, and as the present accident has pushed some questions in which I differ from father and mother entirely into the background, we get on pretty well, and the result may be that I shall stay more and longer at Newnan than I thought possible at first. Well, there's your answer. There's your answer to this whole question of what changed that allowed Vincent to sort of reconcile with his family. And so it's not really that he let Scene go, although that's part of it. It's not really that he realized he needed Theo's help, although that's part of it. It's not really that Rapard and Theo convinced him, although that's part of it. The biggest part was this accident, which, as he says, pushed some questions, including of Scene, entirely into the background. And that was exactly what was necessary. It was necessary that all of these niggly things be reprioritized, that all of these arguments and ping pong, that sort of just be be pushed to the background. And so this injury, this sort of life and death injury, did exactly that. And he said, he says, I'm glad I was at home, right? I was glad I was at home. And he says, the result of all of this is that I will probably stay more and longer in Newnan than I thought possible. And that turns out to be absolutely true. He says, as a matter of course, I shall be able to lend a helping hand, especially later on when mother will have to be moved more often. So here he feels wanted. He feels, what's the word? Not important, but he feels like he's not the shaggy dog anymore. He's actually the son. He's wanted rather than unwanted. He's able to lend a helping hand. That's the total opposite of being a nuisance, right? Part of what he is needed for is he's got to actually carry his mother. He's got to pick her up and carry her from A to B. And you can imagine that's something he's more capable of doing than his father, who's I think about 58 years old at this time. Not that his father can't do it, but that Vincent is far more able to do it as a 30-year-old. About 2 years ago, where I live, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, an oldish lady, I'm not quite sure what happened. I don't know if she just tripped or she fell off some stairs, but I was actually summoned to pick her up and put her into a car for her to be taken to hospital. Not in an ambulance, but in a vehicle. But the thing is, she couldn't get up on her own, and some of the other residents here weren't able to pick her up. So I was summoned for the same task, although it was just a one-off, maybe once or twice. And so this is specifically what Vincent's going to be doing. Is he's going to be literally be sort of his mother's right hand, right? And so his status in terms of the family has almost instantly gone up a few levels. And you can kind of imagine that his father is pleased to see his son being useful and his son being considerate and his son being kind and his son being a good son, right? Okay, so he goes on to say, since the panic of the first few days has calmed down a little, I can do my work pretty regularly. Every day I'm busy painting studies of the weavers here, which I think are technically better than the studies done in Drenthe, which I sent you. Those subjects of the looms with their rather complicated machinery, with a little figure sitting in the middle, will also lend themselves to pen drawings. I think, and I will make some according to the hint you gave me in your letter. Before the accident happened, I had settled with father that I should have free board and lodging here for some time, so that I might use your money to pay off some bills at the beginning of the year. And the money you sent on New Year's Day and about the middle of January was lying ready for that. But as I gave it to father when the accident happened, this time it'll be those color bills' turn. The more so because father has had a windfall, as Uncle Stricker sent him 100 guilders, which I think very kind of Uncle Stricker. Um, so the other family members have rallied around him as well. Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't Uncle Stricker also the father of Key Voss, or am I missing something? So yeah, Uncle Stricker is also indirectly, I suppose directly taking care of the financial situation as well. Paddy says a mutual blessing. Okay, so money. It's quite interesting how he describes it as a windfall, but basically he does send quite a lot of money. Then he says, so far as the money goes, I have not profited from being here. I am firmly resolved to carry on the work vigorously. After about a year, father will feel more keenly the financial difficulties which mother's accident cannot fail to bring in its train. I think it's quite amazing just how forward thinking Van Gogh is. I mean, he's already thinking within days of this accident happening, what are the financial implications going to be a year later? But maybe in another way, it's not so strange because Van Gogh is basically unemployed, and the changing circumstances of his brother and his parents are going to affect him one way or the other. He goes on to say, therefore, in the meantime, let's try to do something with my work. After all, father and mother personally will be secure for life, father's pension being equal to his present salary. So some some people have asked me something like, how do you know that what Vincent inherited was sufficient, or how do you know how much money the Van Gogh family had? Well, there's your answer. He had enough to be secure for life. He earned quite a good salary, and he also had a pension waiting for him. Then he says, but brother, the poor sisters without capital at a time in our society when the inclination to marry a penniless girl is not great, for them life might remain dark and dreary and their normal development frustrated. I'm trying to think, did any of the Van Gogh sisters get married? But let's not anticipate things. It is difficult to say in advance how the constant lying still in bed will influence mother's health. Well, the answer to that question is that his mother would outlive their father, and also Vincent van Gogh, their mother would outlive him, and also Theo. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think also Gogh. So I think their mother would outlive all of her sons, which is quite sad in a way. He says all precautions we can take to prevent bed sores are, of course, of the greatest importance. We have made a kind of stretcher to move mother if necessary, but at present, the less it happens, the better. The most important thing is for her to lie quietly. Taking a difficult situation into consideration, I'm glad to say mother's spirits are very even and bright, and she is amused by trifles. The other day I painted for a little church with a hedge and the trees like this, and they provides a sketch. You will easily understand that I love the scenery here. When you come, I shall take you into the cottages of the weavers. The figures of the weavers and the woman who wind the yarn will certainly strike you. The last study I made is of the figure of a man sitting at the loom, the figure part, the bust and hands. I'm painting a loom of old greenish brown oak, in which the date 1730 is cut. Near that loom, in front of a little window which looks out on a green plot, there's a baby chair, and a baby sits in it, looking for hours at the shuttle flying to and fro, almost like the baby is hypnotized. I painted that thing exactly as it was in reality, the loom with the little weaver. the little window and the baby chair in the miserable little room with a lone floor. Please write me some more details about the Manet exhibition. That's not Monet, it's Manet. Tell me which of his pictures are there. Manet is also an impressionist painter. I've always found Manet's work very original. I must say, this is quite incredible for me to read about him talking about Zola. Emile Zola is a author, and he actually, when Vincent's father died, he painted a Bible which symbolized his father, and then next to the Bible he painted a book by Emile Zola. So his references to Zola are important. So he says here, I'm sorry to have been seen so very few of his pictures. I should especially like to see his figures of nude women. Okay. I do not think it exaggerated that some people, for instance Zola, rave about him, though I, for my part, do not think he can be reckoned among the very first of the century. But his is a talent which certainly has its raison d'être. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Raison d'être, I think. And that is a great thing in itself. The article which Zola wrote about him is published in the volume Mes Haynes. For my part, I cannot agree with Zola's conclusions, as if Manet were a man who opens a new future to modern ideas of art. That's quite a amazing thing that he's saying there, that he doesn't agree with Zola's conclusions. I think later on he would. But think about Van Gogh writing at this point about Manet, a man who opens a new future to modern ideas of art. I mean, that's exactly what Van Gogh himself would do and would become. Really is quite amazing. I consider Millet, not Manet, to be that essentially modern painter who opened a new horizon to many. Goodbye with a handshake in thought. So this is actually going to change. Just as Van Gogh was very resistant and reluctant and thought things were going to be impossible at home, something happened and that changed everything. Well, the same thing in terms of his art. At this point, he doesn't rate Manet very highly. He doesn't rate Impressionism very highly. He thinks this dark tradition is the way to go. And it's going to take him a while for the color to call to him. And I think it's really only going to happen when he goes to Paris. It's only when he goes to Paris that he's going to essentially click. Maybe I need to do things differently. Okay, so I think that is about it. Yours sincerely, Vincent. He also asked his brother to write to their mother a little bit more often. Okay, so let's have a look at this next letter. I think I'm going to end over here, and we will continue with this narrative from the 1st of February onwards. So that is it. Robbie Robbins says, when I was a baby, it was the norm to leave a baby outside in a pram alone in the fresh air for a while. Can you imagine that being accepted now? Yeah, good point. Yeah, definitely not. Definitely not. Susan says he feels useful. Yeah. Just looking at a couple of your other comments. Transference of anxieties and focus for Vincent and his family. Okay, guys, I don't think we're going to quite make it to 2.5 hours, but I'm sure you'll agree that this was quite an interesting sort of fluctuation in the fortunes of the Van Gogh family. In a weird way, there's a saying in Afrikaans, die een se nood is die ander se brood. Nood means emergency. So the one's emergency is the other person's bread. In a weird way, this circumstance was really good for Vincent, and it really set the stage. What happened in the middle of January set the stage for him being able to feel secure at home and not so kind of despised and rejected and judged. Um, Almost in a twinkle, it was more about, wow, life is fragile, life is precious, and the sort of hands-on, the fact that Vincent now had to be quite hands-on, literally, with his mother, carrying her, attending to her, and this obviously he was happy to do, but it also reflected very well on him and helped his case in terms of the situation he was in. Not there yet, says thank you, Nick. This transition for Van Gogh is interesting. Paddy says, thanks for another great episode. Prayers for your quick recovery. I don't think it's going to be quick. I don't think it's going to be quick. I think it is related to my rib, and I am going to the physio again Friday, and she actually said to me today, it's going to be a lot of work. She says there's a lot to do, but yeah, I mean, it's important to begin that journey, that's for sure. Okay, so tomorrow I'll be back with the Colonel in terms of the story of Elvis Presley. So I'll be talking about that. That's also a really interesting story. And then Friday as well, also on Elvis. Saturday as well, so Saturday will be part 4, and then I'll be back with Van Gogh letters on Sunday for episode 26, and then Monday will be the very last in the series on Elvis. So if any of you here haven't caught that, maybe you should. Definitely is quite interesting. Robbie Robbins says, thanks, Nick, mods and chat. I will catch up on what I missed. So, Yvonne, if you come back to watch the rest, I hope you found it worthwhile. If you're watching this on replay and you've enjoyed this episode, you're welcome to hit the thanks button. And that's it from me. I'll keep you guys updated on that little weaver bird. Its nest is sort of in a very cool position to photograph. It's quite easy to zoom in, so I'll keep you guys posted on what that little guy gets up to. I might also try and record him singing. It's quite a unique sound as well. Sky says, love the hat. Yeah, this hat comes from France, so yeah, thanks a lot. I also like it. True Jedi forever. As you arriving, I'm leaving. True Jedi says, got you very late. We'll watch the replay now. Thanks. Okay, cool. Take care wherever you are. If you in the northern hemisphere, stay cool. It's midwinter here in the southern hemisphere, so those in Australia, New Zealand, keep warm. And I'll see you guys next time. Okay.